okay. So what I proposed, guys, is the same thing we did last time. We will just let our speaker tell us about herself and all good things that she does and wants to tell us. And then I have all of your questions. She'll probably hit some of them, but whichever one she doesn't, I can ask them. And of course, if at any point you have a question, feel free. Oh, amazing. Who brought those?
Me.
I mean, you obviously, but like, what teacher?
Oh, Miss Crow.
That's nice. Thank you. So if you want anything hot. Hey guys, I don't mind if you come up to replenish your drinks while we're doing this, but you gotta be super quiet. And don't knock anything over.
And just so I know how to gauge things, when should I stop so we can go out and see the car?
So maybe
2:30ish?
Yeah, we'll want to definitely be done around 2:30 so we can go. And that'll include you talking and the questions.
Okay, excellent. We'll do that. All right, well, we'll get started. Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for the warm welcome. I came last year to Miss Frederick's class, and I'm very glad to be back again, so thank you. I'm Cheralyn Lambeth. As Miss Frederick may have told you, I do a lot of different things. I am a semi-professional writer. I have 3 books published and one that's in the process of being published right now. First one is Haunted Theaters of the Carolinas, which talks about some of the great ghost stories we have around in this area.
We read a couple.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Well, and I also have a book about puppets called The Well-Dressed Puppet. One of my backgrounds is I used to work for Jim Henson Productions with the Muppets. I worked on Dinosaurs and the Muppet Christmas Carol, if anybody saw that. I also worked on Avenue Q for the European tour, building some of the puppets for that. My 3rd book is about costuming and cosplay. You may all be familiar with that. I make all of my own costumes and do cosplay. And then the 4th book is not nearly as exciting. It's in the process of being published, but it's a cookbook on historic Rosedale Plantation, which is a great historic house, a site here in Charlotte that is also haunted. So I am more than happy to talk to you about the writing process, the publishing process. It's interesting to me that all of the things I do are kind of intertwined with each other. Of course, you know, I do historic things with the house that I work with. I do costuming and cosplay and puppets and ghost stuff, and I write about all of it. So it's really fun for me to be able to combine all of my favorite interests. I am also actually an actual paranormal investigator. I do actual ghost hunting with a group here in Charlotte called the Charlotte Area Paranormal Society. We actually just did an investigation at a private home last night, which will be broadcast on KISS 95.1 on Halloween Day. So if anyone's interested in listening to that, you can see and hear some of the things that we discovered. And we also investigate other areas here in Charlotte. I'm a very skeptical paranormal investigator. We don't always think every little thing is a ghost. We try to look for the scientific explanation first. But as I said, it all ties in together, and I call Ghostbusters my dog and pony show, because I'll go out with this, I'll go out with the car, and people will come forward and tell me their ghost stories, because as they'll say, you will believe me, and I usually pretty much do. And I can continue to talk about any of these topics. Ms. Frederick sent me some of your questions. I didn't get a chance to look through all of them, but was there anything in particular I should start with that people were interested in knowing about before I continue on? Like ghost stories in Charlotte, or the writing process, or it's all tied together.
Come on, my baby introverts. Let's go.
Well, do you want to bring up some of the questions that they had, and that way I can touch on the things?
I have a question.
Certainly.
There you go.
You know how like there's a bunch of like TV shows like Ghost Hunters and stuff?
Yes.
Is that actually how when they freak out when like you know how they have like the little thingy when they hear like the voices and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Like, have you ever actually freaked out because they called your name or something?
I have not actually. My crew is not actually freaked out.
Okay.
And I will say that shows like Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures and things like that are the best 30 minutes of what could be a week-long investigation. We kind of compare it to the show Cops. You know, much of what police officers do is if they're on patrol, they're just driving around. So there's not always something exciting happening. And it's the same thing with paranormal investigation. Actually, more so, because ghosts rarely perform on command. You know, you will go and we'll sit in a house, like the one we did last night, for instance. We were there for hours and hours and hours, and really nothing exciting happened. But we haven't played back all of the pictures we took or all of the audio re-recorded, so we may have gotten something and not known it yet. But generally, the shows you see on TV, like Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures, they'll take the best few minutes of an investigation that they've been on for a very long time and compact it all together. So it looks like it's exciting and really happening all the time, but it's really not. And it always makes me laugh. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the show Most Haunted. If anyone's ever seen that show. It was a show in Britain. It was a group of British ghost hunters, and Yvette Fielding, the lady who runs that show or hosts that show, while her group is good, every time she sees something, she screams and runs. Which my thought is, well, then why did you become a paranormal investigator if it's going to frighten you that much? So, you know, we generally try to take everything in our stride. I have seen some very striking things. I can tell you one thing that I saw in particular is, are you all familiar with the Lost Colony? Do you know that story? Of course, the Lost Colony was the first British colony established in North America in 1585. It was over 117 men, women, and children, and they were there for a few years on the coast of North Carolina. But a few years later, when the British supply ships returned, there was nobody there. And no one knows what happened to all of those colonists, whether they were perhaps, they just left because there was no food, or they all died in a storm or other natural disaster or anything like that. So no one knows what happened there, but there's a theater built at that site, and there's a play about the story of the Lost Colony called The Lost Colony. And with all of the activity that's gone on there, the theater is, of course, haunted. And there was one night where I was working in the theater. I was a costume crew member there one summer. I was sorting laundry in the hallway, and I heard footsteps coming up behind me in the hall. So I pulled my basket aside, thinking someone was going by me. But the footsteps continued by me with no one there, continued down the hall, and the door at the end of the hall opened and closed by itself. That actually happened to me. I still get goosebumps when I think about it, because it was really very striking. And the best part of that whole evening was I remember standing there for a few minutes going, okay.
I've had something like that happen to me before.
Yes?
Yeah, but like, it was in my forest, and I saw footsteps getting made.
With no one there?
I didn't want to see what it was.
Well, and I'll tell you, I'm perfectly willing to accept the fact that there may have been some rational explanation for it, but if somebody has it, I don't know what it is. I remember I picked up my basket and walked into the shop, and one of my fellow crew members said, "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Let me tell you. So, you know, I've had some unusual things like that happen, but I will also tell you, too, there are plenty of normal and natural explanations for what's referred to as paranormal phenomena. Electrical wiring can cause some very unusual things to happen. If you stop and think about it, we as people are just a mass of electro and chemical impulses and reactions. So high amounts of electricity can interfere with that and cause us to see things that may not necessarily be there, or feel things that may not necessarily be there. Or they can cause things to happen in your house that you might not otherwise be able to explain, but it could just be electrical wiring. So there are a lot of normal explanations for things like that, and I talk about some of that in my book, and other investigators talk about that type of thing too. It's, you know, not every odd thing is a ghost. People take pictures of orbs, like, ooh, look, it's an orb. Well, no, it's probably dust or moisture or an insect. Those can cause some unusual pictures. And we've had some outright hoaxes. We've had people bring pictures to us and go, look at this picture my son took. And it's like, yeah, that's the Slender Man. We're very familiar with that. People have tried to pass that off for years. We do our homework too. So, you know, there are plenty of explanations other than ghosts for things, but they don't make for quite such a good ghost story.
Maybe off of that, since you write about haunted theaters, what was that the most haunted theater that you've ever been in?
I believe that is the most haunted theater I've ever been in. And it's interesting to note, every single theater pretty much is haunted or has a good ghost story. Here in Charlotte, for instance, you're probably all familiar with Imaginon. Well, Imaginon is a pretty brand new building. It was only built in 2005. You wouldn't think there'd be anything there. But that I can tell you, I've had some experiences at that theater myself. I've seen things move. Some other people have had experiences there. One of the tech guys said he was standing on stage working about 2 a.m. one morning by himself, and he heard a female voice call out to him, "Do you need help with that?" The costume shop manager said she had heard her name called when no one was there. And there was one show I was working on where I just finished dressing an actor. I took the jewelry that they'd had, I put it in a box on the table, turned to hang something up, turned back, and I literally saw the earrings jump out of the box and fall on the floor and roll under the table. I was like, really? I need that for the show. Thank you very much. So, you know, we have seen some unusual and odd things happen. But the Manor Theater here in Charlotte is also haunted. That's in my book. The Carolina Theater, which they're getting ready to renovate, I believe, and rebuild, should be great because it's a great historic site here in Charlotte.
I actually did costume stuff at the Imaginon Theater
this
summer, and I've heard a lot of stories from the people there.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. And they think there may be a young girl there. They think there may be another male entity there. So there are a lot of unusual things. Have you had anything happen yourself?
Not personally.
Not personally? Yeah. Yeah, I've heard some stories and had some things myself. So, you know, even brand new buildings can be haunted depending on where they were built, you know, what's happened to them in the meantime. It doesn't necessarily have to be an old creepy building like we think of.
So one of the questions that we got was, when did you become interested in the supernatural?
I became interested in ghosts and the paranormal when I started working in theater. As I said, pretty much every theater you'll encounter is haunted or has a ghost story. And theater people pretty much take their ghosts as par for the course. It's an occupational hazard, if you will. You know, even Shakespeare writes about ghosts. Many of the Greek tragedies involve ghosts. It's a very common and historical theme. And so, you know, I've had experiences in most of the theaters I've worked at. My fellow crew members have had experiences. And I can tell you, too, that even whether or not you believe ghosts actually exist, they do become part of the everyday operations of a theater. There's a theater in South Carolina, Converse College, that will not sell a certain seat on any opening night, because it belongs to the theater's ghost. And they always put flowers under the portrait of the lady that they believe is there. So regardless of whether or not you believe in ghosts and believe her spirit may be there, they act as if it is, and so in that sense, it's very real. And you know, many other theaters do the same thing. For instance, they won't sell a particular seat, or they'll offer gifts to the ghost that's there. Theater has a lot of superstition. You've probably heard that you're not supposed to say the name of the play about the Scottish king in a theater. You know which play I'm talking about?
You read about it in the introduction if you read your reading for today.
I could probably say it here. It's not a theater.
It's not a theater. We don't have a theater.
But you're not supposed to say Macbeth in a theater, because the story is that the descendants of Macbeth cursed the play when Shakespeare wrote it. And so whatever theater company puts on that play will have a run of bad luck. And certainly there was one production of Macbeth I started to work on where the director, shortly into rehearsal, fell and broke his leg. And they actually, because of that, decided not to do the show. So again, regardless of whether or not you believe the superstition, the reaction to it is very real. Yes?
Why theaters? You said most theaters you encounter will have a haunting story.
This is my personal theory on theaters. For one thing, theater people are very superstitious. You know, we have a lot of superstitions and things that we follow, but also the theory behind ghosts and entities is that they require a lot of energy to exist and to manifest. And there is a lot of energy in a theater building. There is electrical energy from all the lights and the sound equipment and everything that's there. There's also a lot of emotional energy there from the performers and from the audience that's there. And after a while, that all just builds up. So any entity, any ghost that's going to exist or manifest has all the energy it needs to do that. Also, there's what's called a residual haunting. And the theory behind that is it's basically like a record player or a videotape of a past event. There's no intelligence there. It's like you're watching something that's happened and you're just watching a replay of it. And in a theater, of course, the same action gets repeated over and over and over again. You know, if you're doing a play, then of course you're doing the same play every night for weeks or months on end, and it kind of gets worn into the fabric of the theater, if you want to think about it that way. So you might just be seeing a replay of something that's happened before, because it's happened so many times. There are plenty of documented sources that talk about residual hauntings. For instance, there's one house in, I believe it's South Carolina, where every night on the anniversary of something, an entity is said to walk down the stairs of the house and out the door. And it's just that one time, at the same time, every year. And they believe it's a residual haunting, that the entity's not actually there. It just happened, and so it's happening again. And I think that's why theaters are probably haunted. There's a lot of stuff there to support a haunting. Oh, yeah.
How do you choose like what stories you want to put down in one of your books?
When I was working on the Haunted Theaters book, I drew on stories from my own experience. I've worked at most of the theaters that were in that book, or visited most of them. I've worked at the Lost Colony, I worked at Imaginon, worked with Children's Theater for a little bit, and I've been to many of them. I've gone to several movies at the Manor Theater and talked to the folks there about their stories. Certainly worked at the Lost Colony, or had friends and other colleagues, and so I drew on their stories. There were a lot of theaters that I didn't get a chance to touch on that I wanted to. And after my book came out, I had a lot of people like, oh, you should have put this theater in there. Well, I may write a sequel, because I have found so many other theaters that I didn't get a chance to touch on in this book, but that also have good stories. So I might start putting all of those together and try to put that out. I've tried to get a few pictures. I had a few interesting pictures that I was able to include in my book. I'm also currently just kind of dabbling off and on. I'm writing a book about ghost stories in Charlotte. because we have a lot of great haunted places here in Charlotte, not just theaters. You maybe know that Lotta Plantation is supposed to be haunted. The Dunhill Hotel, the Charlotte Observer just did an article on the Dunhill Hotel yesterday or today, I believe it was. The site that I work at, Historic Rosedale Plantation, that's haunted, and I've had some good experiences there. So there are a lot of really good places just here in Charlotte that have some great ghost stories.
Perhaps you can tell us a bit about your history in puppeteering.
Yes, puppeteering is probably one of the favorite things that I do. As I said, I got a chance to work with Jim Henson Productions on some of their programs. Sesame Street Live, I was on Sesame Street Live for several years. But in addition to the smaller puppets, I also work on some bigger puppets. I do a lot of stuff for Sir Purr, for the Panthers, and for Hugo the Hornet. I make a lot of their costume pieces, so that that's puppetry in a sense as well. But puppetry and costuming can also go together. One of my favorite cosplays that I do is, if you've probably read Lord of the Rings or seen the movies, there's, of course, the ring race, the big scary guys all dressed in black with the big swords, and they ride the black horse. Well, I made a big puppet horse, almost life-size puppet horse, that fits around my waist, and I walk on stilts and have fake legs that hang off the side, and then I have all the robes of the ring wraith dressed down. So it really does look like a ring wraith on a horse. And in fact, there was one photo shoot I was doing to get some good pictures of it, and people driving by would stop because one guy said, I thought there was actually a horse here in somebody's backyard. So that's, that combines with costuming and puppetry, and there are many costumes that do that. But I've been working on puppetry for almost as long as I've done costumes. And as I said, I've got my book, The Well-Dressed Puppet, that talks a little bit about puppetry and puppetry costumes. And then I'll be teaching a class at Winthrop next semester on puppetry. So, yes.
Have you ever encountered like a haunted puppet? That's like two of your favorite things, right?
It is, actually, and that's a good question. I personally have not, but there are certainly plenty of stories. You've probably all heard of Annabelle.
Yeah, isn't that a real thing?
That is a real thing. That is indeed a real thing. There's such a thing called object haunting, where there's the theory is that an object has an entity attached to the object itself. So it doesn't matter what house it's in, what building it's in, wherever that object goes, the entity attached to it will follow. And that was the story of Annabelle. Certainly, a lot of those marionettes are very creepy, like the ventriloquist dummies. I wouldn't want to tangle with any of them. And Chucky, that wasn't a real thing, but of course, it's the haunted doll is a common theme in ghost stories and other hauntings. So I personally have not encountered a haunted puppet, but I'm sure they're out there. Because again, Annabelle it's based on a real story.
Could be something interesting for your scary story competition story.
That actually isn't only like in the first movie, like the interlude with the two girls discovering the painting. I thought only that part was true, and everything else about it was fabricated.
Well, and that's the problem with many of those movies, is that the basic story might be true, but then of course they make things up. So many times the real story is not as exciting as fiction, but then sometimes the real story is stranger than fiction. So, Hollywood has a tendency to warp things and change things around to try to make it more exciting, and it's hard for some people to tell, to know what's real and what's not. So certainly the scariest thing for me as both a writer and an investigator is, and this I think is why Stephen King is such an effective horror writer, is when you take the normal and everyday and something that you're comfortable with, and then suddenly twist it and warp it and make it very uncomfortable. There's one short story Stephen King wrote called, I think it's called The Mangler, where it's a story of in a dry cleaning business where the machine that presses and irons and folds the clothes is suddenly possessed and starts going after people. And starts, eating them basically and pressing them and folding them. And it's like, I work in costumes and laundry. That's kind of creepy to me. And there's sometimes where I think demonic hangers are out to get me, because certainly they're all over the place, and they seem to multiply somehow. Either they multiply or they disappear. So, but to me, as a writer and a paranormal investigator, that's the scariest thing, is when something that's your normal every day suddenly turns on you and is, out to get you.
Can you tell us a little bit about your history as a writer? How did you get started in writing, and what inspires you?
I have always enjoyed creative writing for fun. And I started with my ghost book when a fellow paranormal author who also writes books said, you've got some great stories about theater, why don't you just sit down and put them together in a book? And so that's what I did. And I discovered then that I enjoyed the process of writing. And I will say that even since I first started, and the Haunted Theaters came out in 2009, even since I first started writing, the field has changed dramatically. At that time, the process was you would put together what they call a pitch or a proposal. You would send that to a publishing company. They would look at it, review it, and if they thought it would be a good fit for their company, then they would start negotiating with you on a contract and writing schedule and how to start putting your book together. Now, there are so many self-publishing platforms out there. Amazon has one called CreateSpace. There's also one, is it Lulu.com, I believe? There's one where you can just write a book and publish it on demand. So there's so many different platforms now about how to get your work out there. And so many times, self-published work now is doing better than professionally published work. I'm sure you've all read Twilight. You're all familiar with Twilight. And there was 50 Shades of Grey actually started out as Twilight fan fiction. And the author who wrote that presented the idea to publishing companies. They're like, no, this is terrible. We're not publishing this. Well, she self-published it and is a millionaire now because it was so popular. So you can certainly self-publish. And in fact, my next book that I'm working on is a spoof book. It's a spoof of The Night Before Christmas, but it's about zombies. And I'm going to self-publish that one and put that one out probably through Amazon. And I like Amazon CreateSpace because once you've published it and put it out, it's already on Amazon. And it can be ordered and sold through Amazon. So that makes the whole process much, much easier than it used to be. There's not nearly the stigma attached to self-publishing that there used to be.
What are some of the difficulties that you've come across in writing? Like, what are your hang-ups? What do you do when you are at a lack of writing material? You're in a,
Writer's block is awful. I encounter writer's block quite a bit. There are many, many times where I will sit down to try to write, and it's especially hard when you're writing on a deadline. Because when I worked with my publisher, they're like, all right, you have to have chapters 1 through 3 into us by this date, and then 4 through 8 into us by this date. So trying to get all of that finished and in by the deadline can be difficult, especially if you're juggling other things, work and school. I still take classes myself on things, so trying to juggle all of that can be difficult. And other writers have said, just sit down and write something. You don't even have to write what your book is about, what your topic is about. Just sit down and write something. And sooner or later, the flow will start to go again. So that's usually the process I have to follow. I will look at a lot of cat pictures on the internet. I do that too. They say it's not bad necessarily to stop and take a break and just look at fun videos on the internet, and it kind of helps free up your brain and gets you going again. So that's a process that I follow. They also say that it helps sometimes to say, all right, I'm going to take this hour here and just sit down and try to write something, and it doesn't matter what it is. And if you have that kind of dedication to it, then usually you can start the flow going again. That's the trick that I have to do.
So am I right in assuming that you are also a reader?
I'm definitely a reader. I love to read myself. I love mystery novels. There's a mystery author named Dorothy Sayers that I really enjoy. I also enjoy Agatha Christie, which is really good. And as both a reader and a professional film person, I really enjoy or cringe at some of the film adaptations of books that are out there. One of my very favorite books is The Count of Monte Cristo. And the film adaptation that came out a few years ago, I don't think did it justice, sadly. I hate it when Hollywood does take a great classic novel and then completely twist it, because the reason those novels are classic is that they were great to begin with. They were good to begin with, and so you don't necessarily have to change them, but Hollywood does. They put their own stamp on it. So it's sometimes interesting for me to see the twists and turns that they put into a movie adaptation of a classic novel. Yes.
Wasn't The Count of Monte Cristo like a movie in the 30s, I want to say?
It was. They made one in the 30s, and then they had one that came out, I think, maybe 10, 12 years ago. I can't remember when it was exactly.
So the same opinion on the one from the 30s?
The one from the 30s I really enjoyed. And I love the older movies because they were such great costume dramas, too. They would have these beautiful and elaborate costumes and sets. They didn't have computer-generated images back then. So it was great to see the effects and the technical work that went into projects like that. Well, and the Three Musketeers, too. I don't know if you saw the Three Musketeers, not the Disney version. It had, like, I think Charlie Sheen and Chris O'Donnell. And when I first saw the ads for that, I thought, wow. And Tim Curry is Cardinal Richelieu. Tim Curry is an amazing actor. I thought he would be great in that role, and he was definitely the best thing about that movie. But the only resemblance between that movie and the original book was the title. Everything else was completely different. I was so disappointed because that's also one of my favorite books.
Did you feel similarly when you worked on The Hunger Games?
A little bit, but I don't think I had quite as much invested in The Hunger Games. I'd read the book and enjoyed doing working on the movie, but it was not. It wasn't one of my very favorites, and so I didn't feel quite as upset at any of the changes that they made. It was like, oh well, there it is. That's how it goes. Yes.
What did you do with the movie?
I worked on some of the costumes. I worked on some of the wardrobe for the promotions that they did for it, and they shot a lot of it up in, there's an old, I think it was the Philip Morris plant that's north of Charlotte that they shot a lot there, and the plant had long since closed down. It wasn't necessarily the safest. We couldn't drink the water that was there. They had to bring in bottled water. It was almost like being in the Hunger Games. So that was an interesting experience. I also had a similar experience on another movie I worked on called The New World, which was a horrible movie, but it did have Colin Farrell in it, so that was a redeeming feature, where we were in the middle of the woods in Virginia, and here we are trying to do, create all these beautiful costumes in tents over campfires in the middle of the woods. So, Hollywood's not necessarily as glamorous as everybody makes it out to be. It's really cool to see the finished product, but the getting there is not always the easiest. And I know, too, I'll say this, speaking of technical things, we will be going out to see the car, in just a few minutes. But before we go out, do people have questions about creating something like that? Putting together the Ghostbuster car? Yes?
How much did it cost?
It actually did not cost me nearly as much as I would have thought. The base car is a Toyota Prius. I don't know if anybody saw the original Ghostbusters movie, but the one that came out in the 80s, but my kind of shtick that goes with the car is in that movie, the Ghostbusters had issues with the Environmental Protection Agency, giving them a hard time about the work that they were doing. So as I've told people, we've tried to address those issues by going green, and now we drive a hybrid. So people seem to enjoy that, especially people who saw the original movie. And I will say, too, everything on my car can come right off. The roof rack can come off, all of the decals and everything are magnetic, so I can pull everything off and turn it right back into a regular car.
How long did it take you to put together?
I've had it now for about not quite a month. And I will say a friend of mine who has a classic Ecto, one of the hearses that you may have seen driving around town, he's the one that helped me put it together. So, he had built the roof rack, we put everything on there, we've made a few changes and modifications, and it's still a work in progress.
Out of everything you could have done, why did you choose Ghostbusters?
I think I loved Ghostbusters for many reasons. One is it ties in with my paranormal investigation, my actual ghost hunting, and as I said, it's my dog and pony show. I have gotten some great stories just because I'm dressed in this outfit. One of my favorite stories is I was on my way to an event with some of my other Ghostbusters buddies, and we were in the car. We stopped at a gas station. Of course, people from all over will suddenly materialize out of nowhere and start taking pictures of the car. And we had one lady come zooming up and still in pajamas, and she jumped out. She's like, "You guys are Ghostbusters?" And we're like, "Yes." And she said, "You guys actually do ghosts?" I'm like, "Well, yes." She said, "You want to hear some effed up stuff?" I'm like, well, when you put it that way, how can we refuse? So I found out some really good stories just having this that I might not have found out about otherwise. There's a restaurant uptown. It's now called Duckworth's. It used to be the Fox and Hound. Has anyone ever eaten there? It's on 7th Street. Yes, it's haunted. I did not know it was haunted.
My way back.
Well, and the story behind that is, and we were walking down the street again in our gear, and some of the wait staff came out and were talking to us. Back in the 1930s, that building used to be a pharmacy with an apartment on top that the owner and his wife lived in. And the story they told us is that sadly one day the owner came home and found that his wife had hanged herself. And so in grief, he went into another room and shot himself. And that's a true historical story that actually happened. And the wait staff told us that lights will turn on and on by themselves, blinds will raise and open and shut by themselves, and they think it's the ghost of one of the people that had died there. And I would never have known that story if it hadn't been for walking down past there in my gear. So I have gotten some really good real stories that way through this.
Is there like a specific formula that needs to be followed for a ghost to stay in a particular area, or is it sort of more like at random?
And formula for?
Like, this so-and-so has to happen this way, things like that.
No, not necessarily. The theory behind a lot of hauntings is that people either stay in a place they were happy in, or they have unfinished business, or they're trapped, more or less. Gettysburg is one of the most haunted places in the U.S. and probably in the world. And the theory behind that is it was a very, very violent battle, and many people died, suddenly, unexpectedly, violently. And it's theorized that because of that, they were basically prevented from making the transition. They're trapped. And so that's why they're trapped there on that field. I've not yet been to Gettysburg. It's on my list. But I have a good friend who's a Civil War reenactor, and she has told me plenty of stories about Gettysburg. Yes?
Question. So, you know how you said object hunting?
Mm-hmm.
So how is it possible for us to communicate with spirits via the Ouija board?
Don't.
I mean, I've never done it. No, but like, you know, like the movies and stuff,
Yes.
like people have always like, oh my god, I talked to my grandma, like, why do, like, is that actually object hunting?
That's not object
haunting?
No, that's not particularly object haunting, but I will say, not just me, but most serious paranormal investigators do not play with Ouija boards. Because
isn't it usually like something trying to trick you into thinking it's something else?
Well, and that's a theory, but certainly there have been plenty of documented. There's plenty of documentation of people messing with Ouija boards and inadvertently doing something, not knowing what they're doing, and opening up, for lack of a better word, a portal, or bringing something in that shouldn't be here, and then you have to go in and deal with that. Serious investigators do not mess with Ouija boards, and we always advise people not to. Because, again, whether or not you actually believe in things, a Ouija board is actually based on an ancient historical formula process. It really is. So, messing with something like that and not knowing exactly what you're doing, it's like if your car breaks and you're not a mechanic and you don't know what you're doing and you accidentally hit something that blows up your car, it's along those lines. So, yeah, we advise people to not mess with Ouija boards. Yeah.
Where, if anywhere, does your supernatural belief stop?
In terms of, in activity or?
No, like in general, I guess.
Well, and I can say, what I always tell people is I have seen and heard enough to convince me. I don't necessarily try to convince other people. I'm always very careful about talking about ghosts. If people don't believe in it for one reason or another, I'm certainly not going to try to convince you, and I won't talk about it if you'd rather not hear it. But I have seen and heard enough to convince me. There's plenty of scientific evidence to support it. Again, we are all just energy. That's all we are. And you can't destroy energy. If you remember from your basic science class, energy cannot be destroyed. So when we die, where does it go? What happens to it? And, does it go somewhere else? Does it stay here? Or either one or the other or both? So, in terms of ghosts, I have seen and heard enough to convince me that ghosts exist. Now, I will say this. I used to also be a very firm believer in Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and things like that. But the more I work in puppetry and creature building, the less convinced I am that creatures exist, because I know how easy it is to fake the evidence. And I haven't seen any convincing evidence yet in terms of that. I'm not a professional creature scientist, but I am a professional creature builder. So I know how easy it is to fake something like that. Yes.
What was the scariest investigation you've ever performed that was either really weird or unexplained, or just overall just the scariest you've done?
Well, I'll tell you guys this, and we are often asked as paranormal investigators about the scariest thing we've encountered. And I can tell you one experience I had was I went as a guest investigator with a team to Waverly Hills Sanatorium. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Waverly Hills. It's very well known in ghost hunting circles. It's an old, what used to be a tuberculosis hospital, and it's in Louisville, Kentucky. And looking at the pictures, it's this huge brick building. The windows are busted out. It looks haunted, and it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere. It's actually smack dab in the middle of Louisville. There's a highway that runs by it. But the ghost hunters were there. They got some great evidence. Other groups have gone. I went with another team, and I will say that same weekend, the hotel we were staying at was hosting a Toddlers and Tiaras convention, and that was actually the scariest thing that I've ever seen. But the Lost Colony, that was probably the most striking experience I've ever had, because it really did. There really were footsteps that went down. The door really did open and close. And that was not the only experience that summer. That was my experience, but other people confided in me that they'd heard voices, that they woke up in the middle of the night and saw people in period dress standing at their bed. So that was definitely that's a very haunted place. Yep.
So I know some horror stories are actually based off of real hauntings and things that are actually known. I personally have a little bit of an experience with one, The Shining, which is based off of Mohawk Mountain House up north. I was wondering if you knew any, some horror stories, or how much you believe that some of these stories are actually based off of real events.
I know that there are a lot of movies that are based on actual stories, like, for instance, the Blair Witch Project. There really was a Blair Witch, or Bell Witch. she was called, but it wasn't nearly to that extent. Basically, the story was that it was a woman who supposedly practiced witchcraft, and odd things would happen around her and with her, but it was nothing like anything in the movie that you saw. But it really was, the Bell Witch or the Blair Witch really did exist. So that's a true story. So we were talking about Annabelle. That is a real thing. It's, in fact, the actual doll is on display in a museum, I believe, up in Pennsylvania. There's a museum of paranormal objects.
Isn't it like their home?
Yeah.
Like
It's John Zaffis, and he is an investigator and a collector. There's like a TV show called Haunted Collector, something like that, and that's him. And they go around and get objects like that. So, certainly there's there are a lot of Hollywood movies and stories that are based on actual stories or based on actual legends, but that aren't necessarily nearly as scary as they're made out to be. Certainly there are plenty of sightings, for instance, there have been sightings of the Loch Ness Monster. Lake monsters have been a thing, but not nearly as much as many of these movies make it out to be. Things like that.
Well, we had better go out to the cars because we're running short on time. But I'm sure that if you have questions, she'd be happy to ask them out there.
Absolutely.
If you guys want to bring your stuff and just leave after, like when the bell rings from out there, you can't leave till the bell rings. Or leave your stuff here. I'm going to bring my keys and lock the door. And I want a group shot.
Yes.
Before we do anything.